...2017's The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a game that needs no introduction. For many, it's one of the greatest games of all time. For a vocal minority, it's an overrated grass simulator. But love it or hate it, you can't deny the impact that it's had on the vast worlds of open-world games. The Switch's only notable launch title has remained culturally relevant for the entirety of the console's life, propelling the series to a level of popularity never seen prior. The sense of open-ended discovery and curiosity that this game instilled in players was nothing short of magic to those who it clicked with. They packed so much into this game that even in 2023, I was discovering new things. Excuse me, you can parry bees? But even as someone who adored this game, putting in well over 170 hours on Switch, and another 100 plus with CMU emulator and mods, several issues have only stuck out more and more. Taken on their own, each point of criticism wouldn't be enough to bother me much, but when added together, they compound into something far more problematic. A list of flaws that we all hoped would be fixed in whatever Zelda game would come next, especially if that title was going to take the same open-ended approach as Breath of the Wild. Well, it's been 6 years since The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was released, and its brand spanking new sequel, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, has graced millions of Switch consoles with what I can only describe as crack in video game form. What a time to be on the internet it's been. Now that a lot of us have had enough time to see the credits roll and digest the game, I think it's time to answer some of the most burning questions that were circulating during the lead up to this game's release. Does Tears of the Kingdom fix Breath of the Wild's biggest issues? Is the game really worth $70? Can you finally pet the dog? And will Breath of the Wild become obsolete? I'll give you the most important answer now. No, you still cannot pet the dog, unless you build a contraption to do it for you. Wait, where's the Gerudo outfit? Are you telling me you didn't put it in this game?
Oh, Numa, how could you do this to me?
Wait. Oh. There's a lot worth criticizing about Breath of the Wild, but a lot of complaints I find to be a bit overblown. Some of these things carry over to Tears of the Kingdom, so let's get these criticisms out of the way real quick so we can get to the good stuff. I can understand where this complaint comes from, but Breath of the Wild is in a whole other league compared to the typical Ubisoft open world experience, and a big part of what made this game so appealing to so many people were the ways in which it addressed the many criticisms of what other open world games at the time were doing, like littering the map with a bajillion quest markers and having the game tell you where to go at all times. Open space serves a purpose. I think Breath of the Wild is really smart and intentional with its use of its open world. For other videos that go in depth with explaining why far better than I can, see these videos from Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit and Writing on Games. Sometimes this aspect of the world is something to overcome, or it can be used effectively to hide secrets and goodies. It's nice to get lost in a game's atmosphere from time to time, to have room to breathe, and to build anticipation for where you plan on going next. Tears of the Kingdom takes some of those empty areas and fills them in a bit more. Plus, it gives you a hell of a lot more mobility options, so you can get to new areas of the map much faster. The world size wasn't much of an issue for me in Breath of the Wild, and it definitely wasn't an issue for me in Tears of the Kingdom. This game is just jam-packed with content. So, I'll preface by saying that I rarely, if ever, 100% complete games. I think in Breath of the Wild, the most Koroks seeds I ever collected was somewhere in the ballpark of like 80-ish. I never felt compelled to get every last Koroks seed, and I don't think the developers wanted that for the players anyway. I view them more like the video game equivalent of stocking stuffers, and I'm not alone in that. Their main purpose is to be shoved into the nooks and crannies of the world to ensure that no matter where you go, you'll end up discovering them naturally as a reward for going off the beaten path. If you actively make it your goal to find every single Korok seed in the game, no, it's not very fun. That sounds like torture. The game rewarding players with a golden turd, well, it was confirmed by the devs that they just thought it was funny. And yeah, I can understand why you'd feel insulted, but also, you went out of your way to collect all 900 Korok seeds in Breath of the Wild. If you're not having fun, you can just not do that. No one's forcing you to. At the very least, the game does acknowledge that you did this. Like, I don't know what else would have been considered a worthwhile reward. If the reward was anything actually good, then it would put pressure on more people to find all of them and signal that yes, the devs actually do want you to get every last Korok, which would then encourage more people to participate in one of the most mind-numbing things ever. So, no, Koroks are fine. Stop murdering them. I can empathize with this one, especially as a fan of the classic 3D Zelda formula. But I think at some point, something had to get sacrificed. After Skyward Sword showed how flawed the Zelda formula could be at its worst, it was clear that Zelda needed to do something drastically different. Not that Skyward Sword or any of the 3D Zeldas which came before it are bad, it's just that the series desperately needed something new and innovative. It needed to be completely overhauled. It's easy to forget that before Breath of the Wild, the discourse was very different from what it is today. The things most people were complaining about with 3D Zelda games were things like overly long intros that make replaying these games a slog, restrictive linearity that forced players to progress further in the story before they could interact with the shiny thing that they found, dungeon items not having much utility outside of the dungeon that you find them in, annoying repeat content, not being able to do dungeons in any order, big empty areas, etc. Breath of the Wild was that fresh new take on the series, taking Zelda back to its roots. The first proper sequel to the original Legend of Zelda on NES after 30 years. I understand the desire for a more traditional linear 3D Zelda, but linear was all we got for a long time. And sadly, that style of Zelda doesn't sell 30 million copies. Breath of the Wild did, and Tears of the Kingdom could potentially overtake it. That being said, if this new style of gameplay doesn't click with you, that's completely fair and valid. The Zelda name does set certain expectations, and it can be upsetting when certain traditions are buckled, and expectations not met. Especially when there's not always a good reason for certain things to change. I think we need to look at these games for what they are, rather than what they're not. I see these new games as good, just not good at being sequels to, say, Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess. I understand the frustration, and I empathize with it, but this is just the new direction that the series is taking. I am cautiously optimistic over the idea of them continuing to make more 2D Zelda games in a similar vein to the Link's Awakening remake, but as of right now, we don't have any announcements of anything new like that, so we'll just have to wait and see. No! How can you look at this and say that it looks bad? Especially considering the platform that it's on. I'm gonna put a pin in this and come back to this point later because, I disagree. All right, let's talk about weapon durability seems to always crop up in conversations about Breath of the Wild. Many were hoping that the system would be done away with entirely for the sequel. Nintendo said no. And honestly, good. Yeah, it's pretty clear that in this heated political debate, I'm on the side of weapon durability as a system is good actually. But just because I'm on that side, it doesn't mean that its implementation in Breath of the Wild was without fault. What I loved about the system was that it forced me to experiment, it kept me on my toes during combat, and it made the process of finding and discovering weapons more exciting than it would have been if I could just keep them permanently. The combat itself wasn't especially deep and lacked a lot of decision making in and of itself, but the integration of the weapon system made combat as a whole more engaging, as opposed to something to turn my brain off for. My criticisms with the system were over things like a lack of any real indication of how much durability was left for my weapons, not being able to do anything with weaker weapons found in chests if my inventory was full, the balancing of weapons causing them to break a bit too quickly for my liking, the possibility of running out of weapons if you're underpowered and going up against a Lionel or something, the awkward pause in the action when you need to switch to a new weapon or bow. Just the interface in general needed a lot of improvements. The fact that weapons and bows don't auto-switch when they do break, and of course, the dreaded moment when you have to say goodbye to an old friend. And that's a lot. But even with all of these complaints, I still stand by the system. I feel like some of these negative emotions, keyword some, are sort of unnecessary evil. And trying to think up solutions for some of these problems has been pretty difficult. So with that being said, how does Tears of the Kingdom go about addressing these issues? Ever heard of Elmer's? Nintendo's response to weapon durability was to not really overhaul the system, and to instead pull a Nintendo and do something that nobody else could have ever possibly conceived of. Fusing is the cool new thing, and it allows you to stick two sticks together to make a really long stick. Finally, what I've always wanted. This sort of helps, though not as much as I would have liked. Weapons which are about to break can indeed be fused to more durable weapons or random materials, which does prolong the weapon's life a little bit, but you only get this benefit for the first fuse, and eventually the entire thing is going to break, which is really sad if you find something shiny and new, and you attach it to something that's run out of its primary and secondary durability. Weapons are still going to break pretty frequently, though understanding the system and being smart about it can buy you a bit more time, and that bit of extra time was a nice plus. Though the game kind of offsets this benefit by having a shit ton of rocks blocking important paths. Yeah, ore deposits and bombable walls were a thing in Breath of the Wild, but there's way more of them this time around. And without an infinite supply of bombs, you have to use up a lot of resources to get to the goodies. The game is nice enough to at least provide you with the resources that you need pretty close to wherever you need to get to, but this does force you to shift around weapons a lot more than I probably would have liked. You do at least get abilities later in the game that make you not have to use these weapons, so that's a plus. The other issue is that basic, non-fused weapons do far less damage than their Breath of the Wild equivalents. A change that was understandably done to balance the game, but what this meant for me was that I was disincentivized from using these weapons. So nearly everything in my inventory was fused at any given time. Fortunately, this is pretty easy to tell at a glance, and many of the materials dropped by enemies are perfect for fusing to your weapons to make them stronger, giving you more options at any given time. I also appreciate being able to drop items without having to go to the pause menu. That's a nice quality of life improvement. The game does incentivize experimenting with weapons a lot more, it just doesn't fine-tune all those little things that would have made breaking weapons less frustrating as much as it could have. I'm really partial to Rasputin's idea of having these little shards that you gain from breaking weapons that could then be used for a number of different things. The system sort of approximates that kind of idea, but it's not quite the same. As it is now, people who complained about weapon durability in Breath of the Wild still are not fans of it in Tears of the Kingdom. At worst, I found it a bit annoying when I needed to bust out my third rock hammer for cave adventures, or frustrating when my bow would break and not auto-equip to another one. So, while the negatives have largely gone unaddressed, some of these things have been improved slightly, and the stuff that worked about the system in the first place works even better here. Fusing is just insane. There's gotta be hundreds, if not thousands of different combinations, and that's crazy. But now we should talk about how the system interacts with other parts of the game, like how elemental arrows and weapons don't exist like they did before. Instead, the various gems that you find have elemental properties. Thanks to the fuse ability, a lot of materials that were previously useless now serve a function. They've also been balanced out in other ways. Great fairies need more materials for full upgrades, and rupees feel a lot more scarce this time around, so selling items becomes more of a necessity in order to get all the armor sets and full upgrades. God damn it, Even in my escapist fantasy, I can't escape inflation. Thanks, Nintendo. They've also added new items and materials like puff shrooms and electric lemons and tomatoes. Players also have new buffs and status conditions to think of. Things like glowing, slip resistance, glide power, and gloom. With the game being so oriented around how things interact with each other in this sandbox format, any addition exponentially adds to the possibilities. And this isn't even mentioning Ultra Hand and all the penises you can build with it. I also appreciated the small improvements made to the UI, like being able to see more of your weapons, being able to sort things by most used, being able to drop items directly from the menu in cases where you open a chest and your inventory is full. Oh yes, please. You can just throw things now. I didn't realize how much I needed this until they added it to the game. A lot of small tweaks really came together to make menu navigation more digestible, and I feel like the issues bothered me a lot less this time around. It helps when you have all this new and exciting stuff to mess around with too. I was worried about returning to the Switch and going back to all of the constant load times that an open world game on this console would entail. But not only were these load times slightly faster than Breath of the Wild, but the simple change of showing the map on the load screen makes me feel like I'm actively in the game's world. It gives me time to strategize and plan my route. So load times were basically a non-issue. I don't even think it's possible to acknowledge every individual little thing that was done to streamline this experience, but what I can do is bitch for a moment about something that bothers me in Tears of the Kingdom, which was not present in Breath of the Wild. So arrow fusing is really cool, and it has a lot of utility. But the problem is that you have to individually select an item for each and every arrow, even if you're trying to fire multiple of the same type of arrow. Breath of the Wild, you can just fire off, 5 electric arrows. Tears of the Kingdom, you have to pause the action each time you want to attach something. Most of the time, it isn't a huge issue, but on those rare instances where I want to fire off like 10 bomb arrows, it's quite the pain in the ass. A small patch could very easily fix this, so I hope they have the good sense to add that in later. Something that really bothered me in Breath of the Wild was the incredibly limited cast of enemies present throughout the game. For the vast majority of the experience, you're fighting bokoblins, moblins, and Lizalfos. They spice things up with different colors and different elemental variations, but the strategies to defeat them are largely the same. You also have other enemy types like Yiga clan members, guardians, and the many boss type enemies like Lynels, Hinoxes, and big boulders, plus the little baby enemies that are just there to be a mild nuisance, like Choo-Choos, Kisses, and Baby Rocks, plus a handful of other less common enemies. They're pretty neat, but that's about all there is. The Zelda series has always had a vast array of different enemy types, and Breath of the Wild was really only scratching the surface. I was hoping that Tears of the Kingdom would address this issue, and, they added a lot more enemies than I was expecting them to, but it still wasn't quite enough, though I will gladly take whatever I'm given. Pretty much every enemy type from Breath of the Wild returns, ignoring the Guardians and Blights of course, but some of them do have different behaviors and variations, like the Taluses that walk around with enemy towers on their heads, or Yiga clan members that pass their driver's test. Aww. I'm so proud of them. But what got me really excited was when I entered a cave early game and found this thing, which turned out to be a like. And my excitement to see this throat goat of an enemy was simply palpable. We've got likes, Horriblins, the trees from Wizard of Oz, Baby Froxes, however you pronounce the word for this new flying enemy, Big Boss Bokoblins, Constructs, Gibdos, which I was ecstatic about, and of course, the worst hand job in all of Hyrule. Where the game really steps it up is in the boss fight category, with new variations of familiar Breath of the Wild foes, plus new baddies like Froxes, the worst game of Minecraft you've ever played, and motherfucking Gleeoks. I don't want to show much of the dungeon bosses in case you're still pretty early in the game, but this is another win for Tears of the Kingdom. Breath of the Wild was notorious for its dungeon bosses being carbon copies of each other. The first blight you ever fight is cool, but once you realize each Divine Beast boss fight is going to be another one of these guys, they become a lot less interesting. In Tears of the Kingdom, each boss is a unique spin on established enemies or bosses that never returned in Breath of the Wild, and for the most part, these are all really cool and fun. Colgera made a very strong first impression. This boss fight almost made me shed a tear, and the music, it made me feel things. That being said, I still would have liked to have seen a few more enemy types. There are still a lot of Zelda staples that are completely absent, like Deku Scrubs, Deku Babas, Dodongos, Skulltulas, Levers, Beamos, Peahats. I could keep going, but I'll stop with the most egregious of all, Dark Nuts. How are you gonna have a Zelda game with no Dark Nuts? As it is now, it's still a huge improvement, which I don't take for granted. That being said, you still spend most of your time fighting Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos. The actual combat itself still isn't especially deep, but like, hot take, none of the previous 3D Zelda games had great combat either. I consider this game to have the best combat in the series, but that's not saying much. At least here, I had to use my brain sometimes, and dying was a thing that could happen, and did happen fairly often. I go back and play Ocarina of Time or The Wind Waker, and I never die. Tears of the Kingdom has the exact same set of moves present in Breath of the Wild, including Z targeting, parrying, flurry rushing, you know, the works. But in Tears, the player is given more options with the various tools that Link can use, such as the Zonai devices that allow you to make Mickey's Dick Smash a reality, or new arrow types like Puff Shrooms or Muddle Buds. The system is simply more engaging because it provides you with more tools. There's dozens, if not hundreds of ways that you can engage with any given enemy encounter, and figuring out what you feel like doing at any given moment is part of the fun. I don't know how to transition to this next bit. I wish it was raining outside. Hey, speaking of rain, pretty annoying, and it's still in this game. But Tears of the Kingdom gives you so many resources that rain is basically a non-issue. For starters, there's an elixir that you can now make, which makes it actually possible to climb up slippery surfaces. But you could also literally just build a contraption that takes you up into the sky. Ravioli who? Never heard of him. Literally just fuse a rocket to your shield, or use Ultra Hand to make a quick little flying machine, or make a bridge, or find an area with a ceiling and use Ascend. We can also thank Pura for the new towers, which in this game send you all the way up into the sky, allowing you to access the many sky islands. While up there, you'll find various contraptions, and it doesn't take very long to essentially be able to reach any part of the map. Gaining this absurd amount of height makes rain basically a non-issue. Exploration? Yeah, there's a lot. The sheer amount of things you can interact with and stumble upon is just frankly insane. Taking Breath of the Wild's map and making it more densely packed with things to find, plus the Sky Islands, which we all want to call them Skylands, right? Like, it's not just me. Plus, there's the entire underground map, the size of Hyrule, and each layer has its own distinct feel and assortment of surprises to find. Admittedly, there aren't a ton of Sky Islands, and they don't have as much content as I would have hoped, but in a game this massive, that's totally fine. All three of these layers work together to provide a lot of variety with the moment-to-moment gameplay. They almost feel like three different gameplay loops, but they all complement each other very well. The Zonai abilities in the game are functionally just souped up versions of the runes from Breath of the Wild. Ultra Hand is Magnesis, but you can use it on just about anything, and that's not even an exaggeration. Plus, you can combine things together. Bombs exist as items, and in their place is Fuse, which I'm going to compare to bombs since this ability is what allows you to make bomb arrows. Only it opens up a vast array of options with weapons and shields instead of just, being a bomb. Recall is like stasis, only instead of freezing time, it rewinds time, which when combined with Ultra Hand allows you to do so much more. These two abilities alone make you so powerful, but then you add Ascend to the mix, and it's frankly mind-blowing. Ascend is like Cryonis, only instead of creating 3 pillars of ice on a body of water, You can wiggle your way up any surface with a ceiling. You can, get into a lot of places. There are almost no limitations with this ability, and the fact that it doesn't break the game and that the game is in as polished of a state as it is a fucking miracle. Game developers working on much more powerful hardware are blown away and baffled as to how Nintendo was able to make this work. It's insane. There's a whole Breath of the Wild's worth of new stuff here on top of the foundation that Breath of the Wild already laid out. Player freedom, choice, and exploration has been expanded to such an absurd degree, and that extends to ever since A Link to the Past established a new direction for the Zelda series, dungeons have always been a highlight of each game. They've taken many forms throughout the series, but what they always had in common was a rough formula of enter dungeon, find a map and compass, find keys, open locks, do a mini boss fight, get a cool new item, use that item to solve puzzles, get a big boss key, and do a boss fight using the item you recently acquired. Get a heart piece, leave, eventually do the next dungeon. Breath of the Wild, being the first true open world game in the series, had a very different approach. Dungeons were essentially absent, but in their place were the shrines and divine beasts. Shrines acting like little bite-sized dungeon-esque areas that there were 120 of in total, almost all of which being optional, and the divine beasts being the closest equivalent to full-on dungeons, with there only being 4 of them. In concept, this is a smart idea, but the execution left so much to be desired. The quality of shrines could be extremely hit or miss, and that's being generous, with an overwhelming number of them consisting of a repeat boss encounter with varying amounts of health depending on which one you happen to stumble upon. The ones that focused on puzzles were generally over before they really had time to do anything meaningful with their concepts, and all of them were based around Link's base set of abilities, so none were truly able to iterate or stand out. Add to this a repeated aesthetic that, while cool and unique, does grow stale after 120 visits, and many of the shrines end up being disappointing. There are highlights, and the fact that so many of them have multiple solutions is really cool, but the majority don't hit those highs. Also, the slow process of entering and exiting each shrine makes these feel a lot more tedious the further you get into the game. Divine Beasts are more involved, but also suffer from a similar host of issues. Each of them share the exact same structure, and essentially feel like 3 or 4 shrines that were glued together. They do have this added mechanic of being able to manipulate the structure of the dungeon itself, which does add a new layer of thinking, and I like this quite a bit, but it isn't really enough. None of the puzzles really stand out. The build-up is about the same each time, the aesthetics are all identical, and the boss is always some variation of a blight. Dungeons were an area where there was clear room for improvement in the sequel, and it's really interesting seeing how Tears of the Kingdom kept the same core ideas, but made them significantly better, without really having to do too much. So, to start, shrines are back, and there's even more of them this time, 152 in total. Okay, so unless the remaining handful of shrines that I have yet to complete are all absolute booty, I can very definitively say that these new shrines are significantly better. The most significant improvement is that the puzzles are better, and the tools used to solve them are more interesting. The idea of being able to find multiple solutions to any given puzzle has been greatly expanded, and it's incredibly amusing seeing all the different ways that people have managed to overcome different obstacles. The test of strength shrines have been replaced altogether with challenge shrines that are essentially the same concept as Eventide Island, one of the highlights of Breath of the Wild, where all of your clothes and items are taken away and you have to complete a combat challenge. This makes combat shrines a lot more varied and exciting. Eventide Isle was a highlight of the previous game, especially in the late game where it's very easy to feel overpowered and less motivated to engage in the various systems. Shrines in Tears of the Kingdom do all have the same basic aesthetic, just like Breath of the Wild, and the process of entering and exiting shrines is still annoying, but on the whole, I enjoyed these a hell of a lot more than their previous iteration. Dungeons are where Tears of the Kingdom has seen the biggest glow up, which, again, is interesting because they still have a lot of similarities to Divine Beasts. Here, we've gone back to temples. Each one has a distinctive theme like wind or fire, and just like Breath of the Wild, they require you to activate a set number of terminals in order to fight the boss. You can seek out these terminals in whichever order you prefer. There's still no mid-boss, no keys, and no dungeon items. So these dungeons are still lacking in certain areas, and they don't quite hit the highs that the best of the series has to offer. That being said, I still really enjoy these new temples. They're a lot bigger and a fair bit more involved than any of the Divine Beasts were. Their overall designs and concepts feel really evocative of classic Zelda dungeons, and while dungeon items haven't returned in a traditional sense, Tears of the Kingdom kind of sort of figured out a way to bring them back. This is all thanks to two key additions. Zonai devices kind of step in to fill that role, as the temples are able to have puzzles which center around these items. For instance, the mirrors that you find in the Lightning Temple, or the hydrants that you find in the Fire Temple. When visiting each dungeon, you'll also have the aid of a sage, replacing the champion abilities with physical characters that explore the temples with you. Each sage has a unique power, which serves a function very similar to traditional dungeon items. And I think that's a really clever solution. Actually using their powers consistently, well, it's a lot less convenient since you have to walk up to each character individually to activate their ability, and their AI is really bad at cooperating. But at least you don't have to wait for a long cooldown period, so there's that at least. The champion abilities felt a little too good, whereas these abilities feel a bit more balanced. But again, their AI is real stinky, and it's probably the worst complaint that I have for the whole game. I feel like the devs should have at least given us the option to map some of these abilities to our ability wheel and replace this useless map icon that nobody uses. There's literally a dedicated button to the map. Why is this here? At least having them join you physically in battle means that they can attack enemies for you, making you feel really powerful by the end. Their presence also helps to make the temples more memorable and makes it feel like they're actual characters. Much like the shrines, I also feel like the puzzles are just better and more interesting, again helped by the new assortment of tools at the player's disposal. Top that off with improved boss fights and you have a significantly better dungeon experience, with dungeons that are actually fun. The Zora Temple was the only one that I found to be mediocre, but the Fire and Lightning Temples were very close to the classic appeal of Zelda dungeons. Hi there. This video was sponsored by me and all of my lovely patrons over on Patreon. If you like what you're seeing here and you want to help support the channel, like these lovely folks right here, visit patreon.com/zillennialdissonance to become an honorary Zillennial today. And now, before we get into spoiler talk, let's talk about... You can still pause at any time to eat whatever's in your inventory. This does trivialize certain battles, but other areas of the game balance this out a bit more, namely the underground, which has gloom. Gloom just straight up takes hearts away, and these hearts can only be replenished by going to light roots or by eating specially cooked meals. The inventory limitations from Breath of the Wild are still present, and since there are a lot more statuses that need to be accounted for, there were actually times when I kind of needed to think carefully before healing, since I didn't want to waste anything helpful. This helped to make the final boss a lot more challenging, but we're not quite there yet. Flurry Rush. It's not broken anymore. It was really easy to abuse this in Breath of the Wild, whereas in Tears of the Kingdom, the window to activate it feels a bit tighter. I went back to get footage of Breath of the Wild, and I was taken aback by how small the weapon icons are. Nearly every facet of the UI has seen some level of improvement. I was worried that Ultra Hand would be annoying or difficult to use, and there certainly was a learning curve at the start, but it didn't take long for me to adapt and become fairly efficient with it. I'm not smart enough to envision any crazy vehicles, but the game has a lot of pre-made designs and doesn't require the player to do anything too crazy. It's got a pretty low skill floor, but also a pretty high skill ceiling, which is awesome. Plus the auto build ability is very useful. The underground feels incredibly fresh and interesting, especially with the mechanic of activating light roots. My only real complaint is that there isn't a whole lot of visual variety in the underground itself, but in the context of the rest of the game that this area is attached to, the underground does have a very distinct feeling that I liked quite a bit. I forgot that Zelda could be kinda scary sometimes. It's no Majora's Mask, been drowned or anything, but going to the underground is a little spooky. Gloom hands? They're a little spooky. What happens after you defeat the Gloom hands? I'm not sleeping well tonight. I generally really like Tears of the Kingdom's soundtrack, and I feel overall that the songs which are specific to this game are stronger than the ones in Breath of the Wild, but I wish there wasn't as much recycled music returning from the previous game. It's a very small nitpick, I feel, but a few less repeat songs would have gone a long way in making this game feel more distinct and like a whole new experience. I don't know, I feel like I would have liked a new Game Over jingle or something. It's really not that big of a deal since Breath of the Wild had some pretty good music. It was just something that I would think about whenever a reused track would appear in this game. Speaking of reused content, the fact that Tears of the Kingdom reuses the same map as Breath of the Wild gave a lot of fans valid concerns that the game wouldn't have the same level of awe and excitement. The $70 DLC allegations were a bit overblown, but totally understandable. A massive part of the appeal Breath of the Wild brought to the table was discovering new places for the first time. How exactly is this game supposed to recapture that if we've already explored this world? Well, Tears of the Kingdom kind of plays into our pre-established memories of the previous Hyrule, and is able to keep these environments fresh thanks to its myriad of changes with its gameplay systems, as well as the in-universe passage of time. Coming back to these familiar locations is like getting a warm hug from an old friend, and it's weirdly profound in a certain way. This is just one part of why this map feels even more alive than ever. Side quests matter a lot more here, which is interesting since in Breath of the Wild, side quests were kind of on the latter end of the hit or miss spectrum. Most involved fetching a set number of certain items or performing some other menial task. The ones that related to shrines and story progress were the best that the game had to offer, and Tarrytown was the major standout. Tears of the Kingdom created a whole new subcategory of side quests known as side adventures, and these are far more interesting, often having multiple objectives and providing a fun little story to go with. Stories that I felt more connected to, given that Breath of the Wild laid a lot of the groundwork for getting me invested in this world and its inhabitants. In doing so, it got me to care more. The rewards for completing side quests also tend to be a lot better in Tears of the Kingdom, especially with how inflation has really hit Hyrule this time. So I was actually happy to get rupees as a reward, because I was always poor in this game. And just like real life. Oh, what's this? Oh, it's Patreon. Overall, this world feels a lot more lived in, which is fitting. Breath of the Wild's take on Hyrule felt more post-apocalyptic, which it was. Tears of the Kingdom's Hyrule is one that's in the progress of rebuilding, so it only makes sense that so much of the gameplay revolves around building the very tools that you'll use to power up and ultimately save the kingdom. And it provides a good explanation for why there's a bunch of cart parts all over the place. Thanks, Hudson. It's really smart. And again, there's the underground and the Sky Islands, which are all completely brand new. So there's still a lot of new discoveries to be made. All right, and I guess this is where I transition to talking about the story. So without getting deep into spoilers at this point in the video, I'm happy to report that the story in Tears of the Kingdom is a fair bit better and more engaging than that of Breath of the Wild. The story still isn't anything that I'd write home about, but I was definitely more interested in seeing where it went. And the moments of hype were a lot more effective. This game's story hits when it needs to. The thing that most people hated about Breath of the Wild story was that almost all of it took place in the past, and you only get snippets of it by finding these memories scattered all over the world. Each of the 4 main quests were also largely self-contained, this entire format being used to accommodate the non-linear gameplay style, which was executed with mixed results. Breath of the Wild had a lot of cool concepts with its post-apocalyptic world, and the environmental storytelling was really effective. Link having amnesia was a trope, but it worked in this context. The champions are cool, and I really like them as characters, but we never get to hang out with them. The tension of the story happening in the past is real, but the problem with prequels is that we already know what the outcome of these memories is going to be. The flashbacks serve as a way to flesh out these characters, but they don't really get enough time to do that. Tears of the Kingdom honestly doesn't do that much differently, and the voice acting is still spotty at points. This isn't a critique of the voice actors, I just think that they needed some better direction in the booth. But voice acting aside, Tears of the Kingdom improves upon this formula by having a more compelling mystery, an uncertain outcome, and it centers Zelda as the protagonist. That's about as much as I can say for the memories. As for the main quest itself, the stages are this game's replacement for the champions, and while using their abilities is really annoying sometimes, as characters, I felt a lot more connected with them. Again, they pretty much all served some sort of role in Breath of the Wild, which lays the foundation of getting to understand who they are, but even without that foundation, they actually join you for the lead up to and duration of the temples, which allows for the melding of gameplay and storytelling. There's a few other things I want to say, but now we need to get into super spoiler territory. My current verdict is that yes, most of Breath of the Wild's biggest issues are fixed to varying degrees, though not all of them are. And this game introduces a few issues of its own, but all in all, I still had a blast with Tears of the Kingdom, and I vastly prefer it over Breath of the Wild. This game is absolutely worth its $70 asking price, which I will defend post-spoilers, and going back to Breath of the Wild is gonna be really difficult. So those are the spark notes for the end of the video, so you should probably get out of here if you don't want to have the ending spoiled for you. As for the rest of you, welcome to Spoiler Corner. One of the most disappointing aspects of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was its finale. Its greatest strength was the fact that the game allowed you to challenge Ganon head-on right from the outset. But doing so was an incredibly steep challenge that only speedrunners and epic gamers would willingly take on. Because 99% of players can't do this right from the get-go, this end goal provides an in-universe reason to go out and complete everything that there is to do. The problem is that by completing the main story, the final fight is somewhat trivialized. Half of Ganon's health is depleted, shortening the bulk of the battle. And the final phase, while aesthetically pleasing, was tedious and ridiculously easy. The game ends pretty abruptly, and the post-credits reward for finding all the memories feels pretty inconsequential. By contrast, Tears of the Kingdom has a hell of a finale. The lead up to Ganondorf is far more challenging since you can't just ravioli your way over everything. Once you make it to the final boss area, you first have to take on swarms of enemies, regardless of your story progress. The sages will physically join you, and it feels like an actual battle. All of the dungeon bosses reappear, but the sages will step in to deal with the battles themselves. Now, it's just you and Ganondorf in a face-to-face duel. The second phase does the opposite of what Calamity Ganon did, and elongates his health bar to an absurd degree. The sages step in to physically help Link, which is nice because having a lot of enemies to deal with at once is more annoying than it is challenging. But even with all these guys out of the picture, Ganondorf himself puts up a hell of a fight. And I actually came close to losing all of my health and dying, something I did not have to worry about at the end of Breath of the Wild. To really seal the deal, Ganondorf swallows his secret stone, something I should have seen coming a mile away, yet couldn't fathom predicting, and Zelda, finally getting to participate in a final boss battle for the first time in well over a decade, lends her aid to Link. While the difficulty level of this phase is on par with Pig Ganon from Breath of the Wild, the spectacle here more than makes up for it. It serves as a reprieve from the really intense battle that you just had, and to end off, Zelda regains her human form, and in a callback to the very beginning of the game, you must catch her. A beautiful and perfect way to conclude Tears of the Kingdom. This ending just hits. The post-credits cutscene here is more rewarding, as it serves as a nice send-off to the characters we spent a lot of the game with. Minoru's presence in the story was an unexpected, pleasant surprise, and the final goodbye feels bittersweet. The story didn't blow my mind. Hell, I don't even think it's the best story that Zelda has to offer, but it did more than enough to get me invested and left me incredibly satisfied. Still, I hope the next game can find a different solution for telling a non-linear story. The actual story being told is interesting, I just don't like that the majority of it feels removed from what the player does. It also took me a while to realize how to even make sure I knew what the correct order for the memories was, and In this case, I think viewing them out of order actively hurts the experience. You've also likely heard it memed on at this point, but it's frustrating that after beating each temple, you get the exact same spiel about the imprisoning war, yada yada, just from a different character. I don't know what the solution to this in a non-linear context would be, but I feel like they could have at the very least condensed these stories, or maybe they could have had 4 distinct chunks of the lore. The sages in the past don't really have much of any personality, so maybe these flashbacks could have been used as an opportunity to give that to them. I don't know. There's clearly an intended order for the temples, so maybe these could have been different. Ganondorf was pretty exciting to see. I just wish that Link could have had at least one more opportunity to interact with him before their face-to-face encounter. Hell, the Phantom Ganon fight at the base of the Deku Tree would have been the perfect place to do that. Still, the story is a huge improvement in Tears of the Kingdom, and this finale really won me over. So, that's Tears of the Kingdom, and honestly, I've only scratched the surface. I feel like I could easily make an 8-hour video on this game if I really wanted to, but I have to stop somewhere. I have other nitpicks and critiques, but all in all, I don't really care. This game, as far as I'm concerned, is a masterpiece, and I can't express just how refreshing it's been for me to play a game that's gotten me as invested as Tears of the Kingdom has. Most of the games I've played over the last few years, aside from ones that I've played to cover in videos, haven't been all that exciting or engaging for me. By contrast, Tears of the Kingdom was crack in video game form. It was incredibly difficult to resist the urge to drop a few more hours in the world, and it kept calling to me. This whole experience made me feel childlike wonder by reminding me that, oh shit, I actually like video games. Between Tears of the Kingdom and the recent release of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, easily my favorite film of the year, I've been feasting. I don't like using number scores, but I want to make a point here. So if Breath of the Wild was a 9 or perhaps a high 8 out of 10, Tears of the Kingdom is an easy 10 out of 10. It's far from perfect, and I will acknowledge that. It still has a lot of the issues that were present in Breath of the Wild, and it has a couple new issues of its own. But I think it fixes enough of Breath of the Wild's issues and introduces enough of its own insane ideas and technical wizardry that Tears of the Kingdom will absolutely become another genre-defining game. And if that doesn't warrant a 10 out of 10, what even does? I don't think I've ever played a perfect game, aside from like Tetris. Ocarina of Time is considered to be one of the greatest, if not the best game ever made by a lot of people, and that game, I would argue, is even more flawed. Yet, it's still an incredibly significant milestone for gaming, one that still, for the most part, holds up today. I'm predicting that this game will in fact win Game of the Year at the Game Awards, unless Spider-Man 2 is hiding some incredibly game-changing feature, but yeah, it's probably going to be Tears of the Kingdom. I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the game's shortcomings. At the same time, I think it's kind of exciting that these exist, because it leaves a lot of room for the next Zelda game to further improve upon this formula. But at the end of the day, these issues aren't enough to devalue the impact that this game had on myself and on millions of other people. It's probably still not going to win you over if you absolutely hate weapon durability as a concept, or open world games in general, or if you're a classic 3D Zelda purist. But for those who like the game, it's amazing. But is Tears of the Kingdom worth $70? So yeah, I gave my answer already, but let me justify that answer real quick. Nintendo as a company is pretty scummy, as is just about every corporation to some degree. That being said, Tears of the Kingdom is incredibly refreshing, as the game was finished like a year ago, but it was delayed an entire year to make sure that the final product released in a bug-free state. Something all companies seriously need to do. Nintendo has had a better track record with this, but in more recent years, no they haven't. Tears of the Kingdom does reuse Breath of the Wild's map, sure, but it also doubles the map size, plus the Sky Islands. There's more new content here than there was in Breath of the Wild, with its $20 DLC included. If you care about hours of gameplay per dollar, the game goes for $70, and I've already poured over 100 hours into it, which equates to like 80 cents per hour of gameplay. But I hear what you're saying. Were those quality hours? Kinda, yeah. Sure, I wasn't always having a consistent amount of fun, as some segments of the game were more enjoyable than others, and you could probably say that about 2 hours of the game were spent on loading screens, but I wouldn't have kept playing the game if I wasn't having a good time, which I was, most of the time. I'm far from being done with Tears of the Kingdom if my playtime totals from Breath of the Wild are any indication. But the game's not 4K 60 frames per second, and it runs like booty. Okay, this is a Switch game. Did we all forget what the selling point of the Switch is? You can spend quality time with Pura on your TV, and also do that while making a fresh Pura of your own. Now, the Switch is way overdue for an upgrade, but that's not a fault with the game itself. I wouldn't say that the quality of a game's graphics and specs determines its value. Pricing every game at $60 feels kind of arbitrary since they all vary in quality and the amount of content. What I'll say about Tears of the Kingdom is that it's clear that the game at the very least pushes the Switch as far as it'll go. And for as used to 60 FPS as I've gotten playing games on my PS5 and PC with an RTX 3070, I adapted to Tears of the Kingdom pretty quickly and found myself in a flow state quite consistently. Also, games used to go for a lot more in the 80s and 90s, and that's not even taking inflation into consideration. Of course, I get that people struggle financially, and I would still much rather not pay an additional $10 if I can, but it is what it is. Yeah, maybe Nintendo is getting greedy here, but they say the game is worth $70, and for all of the feelings that it made me have, I'm okay paying that. Hell, I'd pay even more if I had to. But luckily, I didn't have to. See, I got me one of them Nintendo Switch vouchers, and since that's the route I took, I saved about $20 and paid $50 for Tears of the Kingdom, which is a really good price for the amount of game that you get. Anyways, I have a leftover voucher, and I don't know what to spend it on. I'm thinking of choosing either Xenoblade Chronicles 3 or Fire Emblem Three Houses. I've never played a Fire Emblem, and I couldn't finish Xenoblade 2 because I was not having fun. So leave me a comment telling me which one you think I should buy. Will Breath of the Wild become obsolete? I went back to Breath of the Wild to get footage for this video, and yeah, it was kind of rough. Breath of the Wild is still a fantastic game, but going back, you really feel the absence of Tears of the Kingdom's quality of life and overworld improvements. Breath of the Wild still has a lot to call its own, including the shrines, divine beasts, and the story, but if I want to sink 100+ hours into an open world Zelda game, I'm gonna choose Tears of the Kingdom. At the very least, Breath of the Wild gets to say that it was the first to do a lot of these things, and its legacy will live on. Breath of the Wild will always have that nostalgia factor. The very first time I ventured through this version of Hyrule was in this game, and that's pretty special. Until then, the only reason I can see myself going back to Breath of the Wild is because I like playing the game modded on CMU Emulator. But once Tears of the Kingdom gets the same treatment, it's Jover. But maybe one day in the distant future, I'll come back so I can remember what things were like before the events of Tears of the Kingdom were set in motion. Until then, I consider Tears of the Kingdom to be the definitive Zelda experience. And as a longtime Zelda fan, it feels weirdly validating seeing so many people having fun and talking about the series. I really want to focus on this moment in time because life is rough for a lot of us right now. And it's important to find those moments of joy and community wherever possible. So if I can get this video out before the month of June is over, happy Pride Month. I hope everybody is doing their best to get by, and I want to thank everybody who took some time out of their day to click on one of my videos. I would also like to give a special thanks to all of my patrons, including Laura Flynn, who gets a verbal shout out because she willingly joined my highest currently available tier. You are insane, but thank you. Lastly, I'd like to give shoutouts to Anorak2370 and Third Watcher for finding all the little Easter eggs and meanings behind my new channel icon. Anyway, I'm going to be stuck in this void for a while, so I'm going to kill time with a few other one-off videos. Up next is going to be a video all about video game adaptations, followed by a special Zelda-related video, because I can't stop thinking about Zelda. So if you're interested in seeing any of those, hit the subscribe. And don't fight the gloom hands. Just don't do it. You're gonna do it, aren't you?